Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to Horse Thief Cinema. And I just want to thank you guys for, I've gotten a lot more views on my Nightmare Alley compared video, so yeah, just thank you guys so much for that. That's great. I'm really glad that you guys seem to like that one. And I really like this idea of comparing movies that have been remade, comparing the old one to the new one. And recently with Dune, the new Dune, getting a lot of Oscar nominations, I thought this would be a good time to compare the new Dune to the 1984 Dune. It's no secret that the 1984 Dune is not exactly loved by most people, and as I'll get into, it's not a good adaptation of Frank Herbert's novel. But I actually do like it. For the most part, and I'll talk about it a little bit. And I'll talk about the new Dune and kind of the ways that I think it's been improved on quite a bit. If you watched my Best of the Year video, you know I really like the new Dune, but I'd like to get into a lot of the reasons why as well. So there's endless amounts of ways you can compare the old Dune and the new Dune. And I just like to talk about the ones that stick out to me the most, and just kind of how interesting a lot of these areas are. So I've got about 4 technical areas that I want to cover, and then I'm going to go into a little bit about just the overall story and why I think the story is better in the new one. But before I can get into the technical elements of Dune, I just needed to give a little bit of a plot summary if you haven't seen either one of them. Basically, Dune tells the story of Paul Atreides, who is a young gifted son of Duke Leto Atreides, who is the leader of this clan essentially on this planet. And House Atreides has been tasked by the Emperor to take control of the planet Arrakis, which is home to the most valuable substance in the universe, spice. And while Duke Leto is excited for the opportunity, he's very skeptical about taking over Arrakis. He thinks it's probably some kind of trap that the Emperor is setting for them. Meanwhile, Paul is clearly a very gifted person. Basically, in a lot of his dreams, he has visions of the future, and a lot of these future events ends up happening exactly the way he thought they would. And there's really so much more I could go into, but I think I would be here for like an hour explaining all the different lore of it, but that's a basic kind of plot setup. So let's get into the technical elements. The first one I want to talk about is just sort of the weirdness and the sort of the grotesque elements that are in Frank Herbert's novel, and this is something I think that the old David Lynch Dune actually really excels at. The novel is very weird. One of the reasons that everyone is looking for spice is because it sort of helps people. It's a drug that helps people navigate interstellar space, and the person that does this is called the Guild Navigator, and after long exposure to spice, this has essentially turned the Guild Navigator into like this weird fish creature. I believe that's in the novel. And they kind of omit this in the new Dune, but the old Dune does not omit it at all. This is the, as I like to call him, the testicle monster of the 80s Dune. It was, supposed to navigate them. And honestly, this is a fairly good, portrayal of the novel. But I will say that I think David Lynch's Dune does go a little bit overboard in terms of the weirdness and the grotesqueness that is definitely present in the book. He just sort of ramps it up to 10. If you've ever seen Eraserhead, which is a great David Lynch movie, you will probably not be surprised at what this version of Dune looks like. Yeah, it's very weird. It's very grotesque. There are lots of technical choices that don't really make a lot of sense, and they're very puzzling. Not to say that the new one is totally normal. When they meet the people of Arrakis, the Fremen, they clearly have an obsession with spit, for example. They greet each other by spitting on the floor because water, any kind of fluid, sort of gives life on this desert planet. And that's weird, but obviously the David Lynch one is a lot weirder in that sense. Of course, I can't talk about the weirdness without talking about the Baron in the David Lynch one. Oh my god, this guy is just... David Lynch definitely, read the book and just decided to adapt this in the weirdest, absurd, over-the-top way possible. Because the Baron has all these whitehead, giant pus things on his face, and he just is completely gross and spits on everything and flies around and just is super cartoony. I'll talk a little bit more about the Baron in comparison in a minute, but yeah, that was definitely a weird thing that stood out. So in general, yeah, I would say David Lynch's Dune is much weirder, and the new Denis Villeneuve one is much cleaner in general. Next, I want to talk about the music. So this is actually an element of both films that I actually think is really strong. So the score for the David Lynch Dune was actually done by Toto, yes, Africa, that rock group. And I actually really like this theme. I might even like it better than the score for the new Dune. It's something that you could definitely listen to a lot. It's very high energy. It's basically like a heroic gladiatorial theme. It sounds like something that if they were making Dune as sort of this Lawrence of Arabia type epic, that it would fit really well with that. Even though I don't think that's the best adaptation of the book, I think it does fit really, really well in what David Lynch wanted to do with Dune, especially on the scenes where they're out in the desert with the worms. It's fantastic. Now, the new Dune is very different in terms of the score. It is, Hans Zimmer did it, and I'm not the biggest fan of Hans Zimmer, at least some of his scores. I think a lot of the times he's just very heavy, but I really do like him when he gets a lot more experimental in his instrumentation, for example, in like Interstellar, where he uses the organ theme to sort of elevate these space images. Dune is extremely experimental as well, even though it is very heavy at times, it's a little too much. But they use like bagpipes, throat singing, and even that heavy, percussive elements of a Hans Zimmer score that, are kind of staples of his career. I actually think it really kind of works in this one because it sort of emphasizes just the way that this hostile environment of Arrakis can just like basically assault you as somebody who's in that environment, especially when the worms are coming on screen. I think it's just done beautifully. There is one little thing that I noticed that I had a little bit of a bone to pick with. I thought it was kind of lazy. There's a track, I think it's the Sandstorm track, where they're kind of flying around in the ornithopter and there's like this sandstorm sequence happening. And at that point the music sounds exactly like this one track. I believe it's in The Dark Knight Rises, and it just kind of felt like a self-plagiarization just a little bit. But overall, I really, really do like both of these Dune scores. Ah yes, now it's time to talk about the effects. So I guess I'll mention the Villeneuve one first. This kind of goes without saying. Denis Villeneuve is one of the greatest current directors, and especially in terms of just creating amazing visuals. Every shot that he has this wonderful sense of scale, and it's not that the visual effects are doing anything particularly revolutionary, but it's just the way that they're utilized. It's quite a minimalistic approach, I would say, but it really, really just elevates everything that they're trying to do. The shields that people use when they're fighting, again, it's very minimal, but it really, really serves the story well. Of course, every frame where the worms are on screen is just fantastic to look at. And then you have the David Lynch Dune. Okay, obviously this was made in 1984. Technology was not at the time what it is today, and it really kind of wasn't the best decision to make a movie like Dune back then. But at the same time, wow, these effects. The worms actually look pretty good still. I kind of think it holds up. It looks not as good as the new one, but it works for what it is. But there's certain choices, like for example, the shields that people use that when they're fighting, what the fuck is that? It's just this hand-drawn, like, geometric shape that they clearly used just kind of stenciled over people, and then they added this, like, blur effect. But given that blur effect, you actually can't see any of the fighting choreography and tell what's going on at all. It looks so bad. But there are some effects that are pretty good. Like, for example, when the worm eats the spice harvester, they use a very fine, like, fiberglass type powder to convey sand from a much further away position. And it looks really good. I actually, there's a lot of effects in this that are really impressive. His use of miniatures especially is pretty fantastic in some shots. But there's a lot of effects that I just don't really know why they tried to portray it that way. It's very weird. And then there's the acting and like the characters. So, I mean, I would be here all day if I was trying to compare every single character from these movies, but I do want to compare a little bit. So Timothée Chalamet, I think, is a little bit better of a Paul than Kyle MacLachlan was. There's a lot of subtext in Timothée Chalamet's like facial expressions in this movie. He has a lot of little tics and twitches that all sort of hint towards a larger meaning in what he's feeling very well. Whereas Kyle MacLachlan is a lot more, I don't want to say wooden, but definitely a lot more just kind of in a void. He just seems a little bit like lost at times. I don't know. I think it was just kind of a movie where a lot of the direction must have just been focused on, hey, how do we assemble this production? And a lot of the acting, I mean, not just Paul, but a lot of the characters in that movie really left a lot to be desired. Who I love is the Baron, as I mentioned. I think in the new Villeneuve one, Stellan Skarsgård does an amazing job as the Baron when he's on screen. He's not on screen all that often, but he is very intimidating, and that's kind of, I think, where they wanted to go with this. Whereas in the David Lynch one, they just wanted to make him like completely grotesque and goofy. He's a complete caricature, but the actor plays this so well. Like, I really think that for what this is fine. The Baron is one of the things that gets criticized the most in the David Lynch one, and I don't really get that at all. I think he's pretty great in it. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the story. This is the one area where the Villeneuve one is like so much better than the David Lynch one. It's no secret that David Lynch, wanted to make like a 4 or 5 hour movie because it's just such a dense book that you really just can't pack all this stuff into one movie. And Denis Villeneuve really understands that with this new one. The new one is 2.5 hours long, which is longer than the David Lynch one, even though the new one is only a part 1. And you can really tell, because when the two movies kind of sync up, you know, when they meet, when Paul and his mother meet the Fremen for the first time, the Lynch one just really goes off onto this train of just incoherence. Like, it doesn't make any sense. There's a couple of time jumps that are just like, what just happened? There's a big fight sequence that happens at the end of the movie that I'm familiar with because I'm familiar with the book, but they do such a horrible job of explaining the context of it. Like, it doesn't make any sense if you're just a first-time viewer of the movie. Whereas in the Villeneuve one, they really take their time to kind of, you know, make sure that they do a lot of good visual storytelling. And I emphasize visual storytelling because the David Lynch one, even though it's very confusing because they're trying to pack all this information in, there's so many scenes where they're literally just explaining to you verbally what's going on. There is so much just verbal exposition. The first like scene of the film is just this woman in space, just like giving you this massive like paragraphs and paragraphs of exposition to explain what this world is. And it's really not executed well at all. Whereas in the Villeneuve one, they have to do a lot of exposition, but I think it's executed in a much more like smooth way. There's a lot more visual storytelling, and there's a lot of exposition that's sort of happening in the background. Like, Paul is sort of, you know, on this computer thing and learning about the world of Arrakis, and that gives the audience exposition, but it's not like a character just says it for us. Also, when they sort of meet up with the Fremen towards the end of the Villeneuve one and about 2/3 of the way through the Lynch one, I think it's handled, again, much better in the Villeneuve one, because the Fremen in the Lynch one just sort of agree to take Paul on because they immediately think he might be this messiah that they're looking for, which it really feels like very unearned and like kind of rushed, I would say. Whereas in the Villeneuve one, there's one member of the Fremen that doesn't think they should just immediately take him on, and he's like, I'm going to challenge him to a fight, and if he kills me, he can become one of us. And again, it feels much more earned in the Villeneuve one. I also think the depiction of Lady Jessica is so much better in this new one. There's a lot of backstory to her character. She's very important. I imagine she's going to be very important in this part 2 that they're doing. And in the Lynch movie, like, she's very much in the background. She's like, you know, kind of a lot of how female characters were at the time. But in this new one, she's allowed to be very authoritative and, you know, she embodies the character in the book very well. And the biggest way in which the stories diverge is that in the Lynch one, and by the way, this is a massive spoiler for part 2 and the book, so if you're not interested in hearing this, you can just sort of skip a little bit. But I mentioned that the Fremen are looking for this messiah character. In the Lynch one, they actually make Paul this literal, like, god messiah type figure, and that's kind of how they end the movie. But that's not really how the book works at all. In fact, the book doesn't really have that even conclusive of an end, and it sort of sets up for Dune Messiah, which is the next book. But the whole point is that, yeah, Paul isn't actually this Messiah. He's this witch organization, the Bene Gesserit, have been planning all these secrets across the galaxy, and that's kind of why the Fremen believe this lie that they've set up. And they sort of put all this faith into this one, you know, Messiah figure, Paul, and it, you know, bites them in the ass. It's not... It's sort of Frank Herbert's like cautionary tale of sort of these figurehead type leaders. And so for that reason, it really, the Lynch movie, it just, yeah, compared to the book, it kind of, but it's a little bit of a betrayal of it, honestly, just in terms of the story. And all that being said, the biggest difference that I have to talk about is this. What the fuck is this? There is a scene where the Baron has captured a member of House Atreides, and he's poisoned him. He's like, in order for you to for you to have the antidote, I'm going to milk this cat, and that's going to make you receive the antidote. It's like, what the fuck? So I really am kind of glad that this David Lynch one exists. Like, that's very interesting, and it's a fun movie to watch. Like, I really don't think it's as bad as everybody says it is, but it's not a good movie either. It's really, really rushed in terms of the story, but you can definitely have fun with it. Whereas the Villeneuve one is, especially when part 2 actually comes out, I think it's going to be a sci-fi masterpiece, essentially. Yeah, anyway, that's Dune compared. If I had to grade each film, I would give the 1984 Dune 3 stars. That's right, we're moving to stars now as the system. And I would give the Villeneuve Dune 4.5 stars. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoy more of this sort of compared type thing. I really enjoy doing it. And if you like this video, you can like the video down below and subscribe to the channel. I've got more content coming out soon. And I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks.